Dad, I want skating lessons.
Son, you know, once you start, there's no going back.
I know.
This means total commitment. Once you begin the path, there is no leaving the path. Are you sure you're ready for that? I mean, really ready?
I guess so.
Neat. We'll start tomorrow.
When someone mentions the Axis powers of World War II, there are probably a few big examples that come to mind. Germany, Italy, Japan. You may even be a bit more versed in the history of the time and answer Hungary, Romania, or Bulgaria. Of course, all of these answers are correct, but I'm willing to bet when I say Axis powers that few of you think of the Middle East. I mean, after all, such a concept seems unthinkable. It's a lobotomite! Given how a certain influential head of the Axis nations felt about people who aren't white. But believe it, because it happened. The Kingdom of Iraq, for a brief amount of time, firmly aligned itself with Hitler and actively fought against the Allies. This is the story of Iraq's role as an Axis power in World War II. The modern-day borders of Iraq were created at the end of the First World War. Upon the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East holdings that the Ottomans once controlled were partitioned and carved up by the British and the French. To vastly condense the history, France would end up with control over the territory that encompasses modern-day Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would gain control over Palestine, Jordan, Kuwait, and of course, Iraq. Iraq officially came under English control in 1920, and before the people of Iraq could even begin to settle into their new colonial status, the newly established British administration began to fire en masse the previous Ottoman officials and began to replace them with British ones. While life under Ottoman rule wasn't perfect for the Iraqi people, it was at least a life within a country ruled by other ethnic Iraqis with connections and at least some care for the land they ruled over. However, these Europeans had no connection to the land they ruled over, and it became almost immediately obvious to the average Iraqi that their new leaders cared for king and country and the resources of the land more so than the people they were supposedly supposed to be providing security and prosperity for. Because of this, it shouldn't come as a shock that an independence war against the British soon broke out. The same year that colonial rule took effect in Iraq, the Great Iraqi Revolution, as it is sometimes called, began in Baghdad. Led by former Ottoman generals, uprisings began to spring up in all parts of the country. However, it just was not meant to be. By October of 1920, the revolution had been crushed by the British and order was restored, but not before some almost 10,000 Iraqi civilians and soldiers had been killed, along with 1,000 British and Indian soldiers, plus almost 2,000 of them wounded. Though a military defeat for the Iraqis, it would turn out to be a major political victory for them and a starting step towards eventual independence. Soon after the war's end, Iraq was essentially granted the status of an autonomous holding by the British Empire. In 1921, the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq was created. An Iraqi king, Faisal bin Hussein, would be officially coronated. A professional Iraqi army would be established, and over time, more and more ethnically Iraqi officials would find themselves as the heads of numerous political and military positions. However, in many ways, the country was still at least nominally under British control. The monarch still relied heavily on British economic support, British officers still had command over Iraqi militias, and the country overall would still remain jointly controlled by Iraqis and Britons. And of course, that sweet, sweet Arabian oil would continue to be extracted by English-led companies. That was, however, until 1932. On October the 3rd, 1932, following the signing of the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty 2 years prior, Iraq was relinquished from its status as a British protectorate and was thrust into the geopolitical sphere as a fully independent and self-governing nation-state. Still, with King Faisal bin Hussein acting as its head, the country acted as a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. However, from the onset, the country was rife with instability. Given the fact that Iraqi's parliament had been established by the British and that the Iraqi people had no real president at the time to want or support the ideals of democracy, the legitimacy of Iraq's government was called into question by many of its citizens. And very quickly, the so-called democratic government of Iraq quickly devolved into multiple different fractured political cliques and cults of personality. This instability would eventually, in 1933, begin to spill over into various acts of violence that would plague Iraq for nearly a decade after. In 1933, King Faisal bin Hussein, age 48, died in Switzerland of a heart attack. His son, Ghazi bin Faisal, would become Iraq's king in the wake of Hussein's death. Later on that year, an estimated 600 to 3,000 Assyrians seeking asylum from French-controlled Syria were massacred by the Iraqi army in what has been regarded as the Simele massacre. In 1935 and 36, several Shia uprisings were brutally suppressed by the Iraqi government, and on that same year of 1936, an Iraqi general by the name of Bakar Siddiqui would lead a successful coup d'etat against the then Prime Minister Yassin al-Hashimi, only for Bakar to be assassinated less than a year later himself. And then in 1939, King Ghazi would be killed in a car accident, his car having allegedly been made to crash by British saboteurs. With no living heirs of the previously deceased King Hussein, a flimsy regency government was formed with one Prince Abd Allah as its head. Fast forward to April of 1941, and we have yet another coup d'etat within the Iraqi government. But not just any coup, a fascist coup. Overthrowing the pro-Allied government under Prime Minister Taha al-Hashimi, Rashid Ali al-Ghalini and his pro-Nazi National Defense government came to power. Immediately after the takeover, Nazi Germany, Italy, and Vichy France immediately got to supporting the fascist Iraqis by supplying them with aircraft, guns, and even dispatched a small contingent of foreign volunteers. Vichy France would give Iraq military access through Syria, and also allowed for them to refuel their planes within Syrian territory. Through all of this, likely feeling a bit uncomfortable with the country's sudden flip to fascism, Prince Abd Allah fled the country with his family. Emboldened by the support from his newfound allies and his recent purging of government officials he deemed suspicious, Rashid sought to removing any and all traces of British influence in Iraq. Pro-British and pro-Allied politicians were arrested. Radio stations broadcasting anything deemed as harmful to Iraq's government was shut down. The only thing standing in Iraq's way of purging anything and everything British were British-controlled Air Force bases. The British by this point were very politically wary. Though no hostilities had broken out yet, a pro-Allied Iraqi army in exile was created. The Royal Navy would dispatch a task force to the Red Sea, and Indian troops would land in the Iraqi town of Basra. However, on April the 20th, 1941, a portion of the Iraqi army, the fascist one that is, established positions around an Allied airbase outside the town of Habaniya. An Iraqi envoy handed orders over to the British, telling them that all troops and aircraft on the base were prohibited from moving off unless given orders to do so by the Iraqi government. The British refused this order and countered the demands by ordering the Iraqi army to abandon their positions around the base immediately, to which the Iraqis refused. A stalemate ensues that lasts for almost 2 weeks, until, on the early morning of May the 2nd, the British bombarded the Iraqi positions overlooking the airbase, marking the beginning of the Anglo-Iraqi War. Almost immediately after the war broke out, the RAF would take to bombing Iraqi railways, military positions, and various forms of infrastructure. With their supply lines cut and no way to reliably combat the RAF, the Iraqi army withdrew from their positions around the British base on May the 6th. 2 days later, and attacking from neighboring Transjordan, the British Arab Legion crossed the Iraqi border, and on the same day laid siege to the forge of Rutba, which had been recently taken by the Iraqi police a week prior. After another 2 days worth of RAF bombing, the garrison force quietly withdrew from the fort, leaving the British forces to take control of it once again. From there, the Arab Legion would gather in strength after traveling to the town of Habaniya. This force would be, creatively, known as the Habaniya Force, being made up of several infantry regiments, cavalry brigades, as well as various artillery and mobile units. From Habaniya, the Allied force would march on the town of Fallujah, and on the night of the 18th of May, after crossing the Euphrates River, the Battle of Fallujah began. The first Battle of Fallujah, that is, not the other Battle of Fallujah. Between the 18th and the 21st, the British would encircle the town and would continuously bombard the base with artillery and aircraft, and any bridges that led out of the town were stormed and secured by British and Arabian infantry. On the 22nd, after the town's garrison had already surrendered, the Iraqi army would counterattack the Allied force. This counterattack would be headed by the Iraqi 6th Infantry Brigade, supported by a number of attached L-335 light tanks donated by Italy. Though some progress would be made in the northeast of the town, the Iraqi counterattack was ultimately repelled. 1 day later, on the 23rd, planes of the Iraqi detachment of the Luftwaffe would strafe British positions in the town. Would have been nice if they had been present a day earlier, huh? A few days later, on the 27th, Indian troops who were previously stationed in the Iraqi town of Basra on the Red Sea began their advance northwards towards Baghdad, with the intent of linking up with the British forces in the north, who had also begun to advance towards Baghdad on that very same day, though the advance in the north was slow, as many of the bridges between Fallujah and Baghdad had been destroyed by the Iraqis. 2 days later, on the 29th, despite having nearly 20,000 professional soldiers to defend the capital with, as opposed to only 2,000 British soldiers within striking distance, many members of the Iraqi national government, including Prime Minister Rashid Ali, would flee the country to Persia. And 2 days later after that, on the 31st, the mayor of Baghdad and a small Iraqi delegation, including the British ambassador to Iraq, Kinahan Cornwallis, would approach British forces near the city. That same day, negotiations began, an armistice was signed, and the Anglo-Iraqi War ended, and Iraq renounced its Axis ties, and a pro-British government would be re-established. And that is the story of the little-known Axis power of Iraq.
Yeah, like that's ever gonna happen.